Welcome to the On Garden Design podcast with Fleur and Sachi, where we chat about what makes a garden great and try to inspire and make designing accessible to anyone who's interested in gardens, plants and chatting. Your hosts are longtime friends, Fleur and Sachi, who bring a fresh perspective and their life experience to designing gardens as a second career. You can find us on Facebook and Insta. We'd love to have you subscribe so you know when the next episode is available. So, hi Sachi, what are we chatting about today?
Hi Fleur. Well, it's the beginning of spring and now is the time to be talking about cottage gardens because they are the thing that comes into their own in spring.
Yeah, it's been a bit of a bleak winter. For those of you who aren't aware, we're in climate
Frosty
zone
Canberra.
9A in Canberra. But the wonderful thing is this is not a gardening podcast, so it's applicable to anyone across the world because we're talking about design and structure and this is probably a good opportunity to do a shout out to some of our listeners around the world.
Yeah.
And how exciting it is to have so many from the US that are listening, some UK, but also some really interesting little pockets around the world.
Montenegro.
Estonia.
Taiwan.
Argentina. Sweden.
We're global. We are global.
So it's really fun. So thank you to all those listeners and I hope that you can get a lot out of these.
Absolutely. So let's keep going because I think the cottage style is something that everyone kind of has an idea about what, a cottage garden is. But really when you break it down, there's a lot to it. It's not quite as simple as it might appear on the surface. And I realised this when I started to look into, well, how do you structure something to be a cottage garden? But I think it'd be really useful for you to go back to a bit of history where they came from because that kind of sets the scene almost.
Yeah. So really it is a sort of a British origin type of thing. And when we think of cottage gardens, my mind sort of goes back to pictures of like Hidcote Manor Gardens, Sissinghurst, Anne Hathaway's cottage. A lot of people have seen that. They got that idea.
As soon as you say Anne Hathaway, I think of The Devil Wears Prada. We're not talking about that Anne Hathaway.
That's right. No, that's right. So we're talking of, really traditional sort of English style cottage gardens. And the origin of the cottage garden was actually a peasant-fed garden. So it was about functionality, practicality.
So what do you mean peasant-fed? What is that?
So a garden that feeds a peasant.
Right, because I would have thought that's like, what do they do with cornflowers and hollyhock?
Pollinators. So it was all about mass amounts of pollinator-friendly plants that intermingled with all the beauty in a cottage garden was all the edibles.
Yeah, okay.
So the herbs and the veggies were grown in amongst it. And so this was about getting maximum impact for feeding. And the peasants didn't have a lot of time to feed themselves.
I was about to say they weren't making gardens to look pretty.
That's right. It was functional.
Yeah.
And this was a great way, in a fairly short growing season to get the best pollination for your veggies and herbs.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. Because immediately you said, it was a peasant-fed garden. I was thinking about those random things that they used to eat back in the Middle Ages. When they used to put honey in offal and all. I was thinking, gee, there's going to be some interesting uses for hollyhock here and delphiniums. Not quite. Anyway, let's keep going. So, because it's interesting, because how were they laid out if they were like a peasant type garden?
Originally laid out with think of very much a rectilinear block, so rectangle, fancy word for rectangle.
Let's stay basic here.
That's right, rectangle with a central path straight down the centre, and on either side are garden beds. And those garden beds are just mass planted, so it was just a central avenue, and that's how it was managed. So that's where it started, but it has morphed, and it's morphed because of, say, designers like Gertrude Jekyll, really synonymous with the cottage-style garden, but brought that into the bigger English country-style garden where you've got these reminiscent of cottage style, these beautiful perennial borders on a bigger scale. And so that's sort of an indication of how the origin of a cottage garden has morphed into something more grand, and now we're seeing it interpreted in more modern styles across the world.
Well, and it's interesting because when you talk about it was effectively a rectangular garden with a straight path, nowadays a lot of the, I guess, the commentary around cottage gardens talks about avoiding symmetry and straight lines, avoiding those things and avoiding balance and too much matchy-matchy.
Yeah.
So really, the feel of a cottage garden is chaotic, it's effusive, it's full, and it's kind of random.
Yes, and that's, I think, the romanticised version that we want to have in our gardens now. And we have this idea that they've just got this sensory profusion, there's this movement, there's scents, in scent in terms of smell.
No, they're really, people have to be smart if you go into there. You've got to have common sense.
There's probably not much common sense because they're actually a little bit fussy, but we'll get into that later.
I don't know. I think a cottage garden makes a lot of sense in that in many respects, it's actually quite a low maintenance or effort garden because there isn't a lot of clipping and pruning and shaping and structure and formality in it.
Yes, it's typically unsophisticated and random and chaotic, but there's actually, to be able to design that actually takes a fair bit of...
Yeah. To make it look natural. Yeah, that's right. That's right.
To make it look natural. And there's actually a real skill in that. And we'll get into some of that when we talk some of the plantings. But in general, the layout, I think it's a really good point that it started in one way, but it's morphed into this beautiful sense of flow and irregularity, organic curves, and really looking at setting that up. You have to start with your layout. So if you're a home gardener, a cottage garden is actually a really great DIY project. It's something you can do yourself, and I think that's why we're talking about it up front. Is it's generally an easy style. It's a great way to do a garden on a budget. It's you can have this wonderful colour, and you can get recycled materials. You can get second hands,
which are cheap.
It's everything that you can actually create a beautiful garden cheaply. It's some of the ongoing maintenance and also the full seasonality that's going to be the challenges for you.
That's right.
For that season of spring and summer and part of autumn, you don't want to be seeing soil at all. Yep. It's just flowers and foliage and mass. And you'll have that sort of spring flush that starts to really fill out the bare spaces. And then summer, a lot of the really kind of taller perennials and, I guess really perennials come to their own. And then they sort of die down. You have this sort of autumn flush, and then it all just backs back.
Yeah.
And winter is a really bare zone.
Very much. Yeah.
That's when you see your layout. See
That's
if you got
right.
it right.
That's exactly right. So back to our first episode where you're looking at your structure in your winter garden. Again, for a cottage garden, that's a good time to be really looking at it because a lot of your perennials have died down. And I guess the other thing that characterises a cottage garden is very much that it has a colour theme often. And what comes to my head is often the softer hues, sort of the pastel tones that are
Pinks
very
and purples
and pale
whites.
Yellows, buttery yellows and creams and that kind of thing.
Very romantic.
Yeah, that's right.
Pastels and romantic.
I know, and I can hear the birds tweeting, and the bees buzzing already because it is very flower filled as well. It relies a lot on flowers, and I think one of the things that is important to remember is that sort of informal planting thing. There are no rows. But you do have repetition. So you have a lot of the same plants, but you don't have them in rows.
Yes, and the idea, what you really want to achieve here is this sense that the garden has just grown to its own. It's kind of like, think of The Secret Garden, that fabulous book.
Yeah.
Francis
I can't
Burnett
remember.
or something?
I can't
Hodgson
remember.
Burnett, something.
Well, you've got a better memory than me for that, at least.
Digging really deep. But think of that sort of the idea that, you go through this little almost hidden wooden door in the hedge, and you come into this space that's just self-seeded over the years. There's just this sort of mass and colour and sensory.
Riot of colour comes to mind.
That's it. And it's just a magical kind of place that's really, I think this really ticks something deep in our psyche that says it's a really natural space where things just grow because they're happy there.
Yes.
And that's why you see a lot of the paths, rather than sort of paved paths, you might see gravel, you'll see cobblestones or bricks laid where they've got spaces between them where seeds can fall in, and then you'll have a little, might have a shrub that's just coming completely out of the middle of the pathway.
Yeah.
And that's good.
Yeah, that's right. And that is what's encouraged in a cottage garden. So before we move on to things like materials, anything else about layout that you particularly want to flag around this one?
I think what we're seeing more so in the modern interpretation of the cottage garden is layouts that lead to features. So a layout will have sort of a series of paths that lead to a little destination or a journey waypoint on the journey, and so that might be where a little sculpture goes.
I was about to say a feature is a sculpture.
Or even a little garden shed that's really cute.
Yep.
Done in rustic materials, or a glass house done out of recycled glass windows and built in a rustic kind of way.
Or a sundial. Obelisk.
Obelisk. Love them.
Those things
Beautiful
are very cottagey.
urn that's got a lot of patina.
That's right. Or maybe even a still water bowl of some sort.
Yes. Yeah.
And, one of the other things I was just thinking about, a cottage garden is a very sensory garden too. So fragrance, as we were talking about earlier, but also that sense that there's lots of different textures and heights and I guess movement. Exactly. I'm thinking birds and bees, but also the swaying of, quite fine foliage as well is all part of how a cottage garden comes together.
Yeah, it very much is. We keep going back to plants because it very much is dominated by this sort of chaotic spread of plants and not sophisticated varieties, just
bog standard
everyday
ones.
stuff. That's right. That's right.
That's right. So, do you want to talk about plants now? Because we're
maybe we should.
Yeah.
Because plants are probably
the foundation
dominant
of this one.
part of the whole cottage garden look, and this is where really it has to be. A successful cottage garden is a mix and a mass of everyday sort of plants that are pretty, flowering, very much flowering plants. It's all about the flowers, less so about the foliage. So that's where it's generally perennials because they will all die back in winter.
And I think that the good thing for people like me who are slightly lazy gardeners is that because they're common plants, they're usually the easy to grow ones. And they are easy to grow and lots of different types. And as we were saying, they are chosen for their scent. And, foliage is important, but it's not as important as flowers. But also there's often medicinal types of plants used in cottage gardens. And that, I think, harks back to the peasant foundations for these.
Yeah, very much so. And some of those sort of medicinal plants, particularly the herbs, have the most beautiful flowers.
They do. They're often small, though. They're not spectacular flowers, but they are massed flowers.
They are massed, yeah.
I'm thinking of daisies in particular.
Oh, okay.
For
I was
some
thinking
reason.
things like lemon verbena and...
I don't even know what the lemon verbena flower looks like. What is it like? All I know about lemon verbena is that it makes great tea.
Yeah, the leaves are good.
That's right, medicinal.
Yes.
Medicinal.
But think of all the sage family, all of your salvias. They're all in the medicinal kind of range.
They are.
And rosemaries and, anyway.
Yeah, all of that.
All that. So,
and what I like about it is self-seeders are a big feature. So, and I'm trying valiantly in my current garden to get more of the self-seeding to happen. And it can be challenging to get a mix because some things do better than others. But things like Nigella, which looks a bit like a cornflower.
Yeah, also known as Love in the Mist.
Yes, Love in the Mist, exactly. Fantastic names, like Forget-Me-Nots. That's another one, right. The poppies is another one that comes to my mind. And jonquils and the daffodils, all the bulbs.
All the bulbs, yeah.
That's right,
beautiful.
The narcissus and all of those different types of bulbs are featured in a cottage garden.
Yeah. Oh, your ranunculus. I love that.
Oh, yes. I've got this fantastic ranunculus that I bought at Woolworths. I'll fess up now for peanuts because, it was looking pretty average when I bought it. And it is just giving me the most amazing flowers year after year after year. It is white with pink rims and they're quite hard to find because I've looked for them online subsequently. Stunning. Absolutely stunning. That's a tip. Go and find yourself something at Woolies.
That's right.
So what else is there about plants?
Just on plants. So when you think of a cottage planting combinations, what do you think of in terms of plants?
Yeah, well, I immediately think roses, and I think climbing roses over things like trellises or arbours. I probably then just think about the things that we've been talking about. So the lavender is another big one that comes to my mind. But the Love in the Mist, the Forget-Me-Nots, all of those perennials that
the
travel
columbines,
through.
also known as aqualegias,
Also known as
granny's
bonnets. These have fantastic names. They should be actually called not cottage gardens, but gardens with random common names.
Well, you know they're probably random common names because they have been sort of peasant-like.
Oh, yeah, they've evolved.
They've just evolved and they've become, some people just don't know their
real names.
They've just become common names. And I think of, because they're the ones we've mentioned there, like, particularly Nigella, the Aquilegia, and some of the other ones. Forget-me-nots, that's right. They're the ones that they're self-seed. They're actually, this is the interesting discussion about plants in a cottage garden. They're the ones which have bully tendencies.
They are dominating.
They will dominate. And I put a couple of Aquilegias in my cottage garden bed, and I tell you, the Aquilegias are the things that have dominated. So now
taken over.
And so I think the real challenge is, if you want to get that cottage garden mix, you have to selectively edit out those dominant plants and control them, because you need space for your lupins and you need space for your delphiniums.
And your hollyhocks.
Hollyhocks and foxgloves.
That's right.
And they're the kind of classics that sort of scream at you to say, this is a cottage garden. And they give you that beautiful height. They
do, which gives you that interest rather than having just a sort of more flat-looking meadow. Absolutely. Any other key plants that you would use in a cottage garden that we haven't talked about? Because I think the thing that really struck me when I was thinking about cottage gardens is there's not a lot of evergreens. Yeah. It really is deciduous and obviously perennial plants. And the other thing that we were talking about before is that trees don't feature a lot. But if you did have trees, because you do want some structure in your garden, you probably want some of that, something that's there the whole time. The kinds of things that really fit for a cottage garden would be your crab apples, so beautiful spring flowering blossoms. The crab apples, the malus, or the prunus, the plum,
ornamental
or the cherries.
Yes.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And perhaps a weeping, something rather. That might actually make a bit of a focal point that you were talking about before, where you might have at the end of a little meandering path something to go and look at.
Yes. I think that's a really good point, because if you do want to lift up your garden a bit, I know a lot of cottage gardens.
As in like height-wise.
Height-wise, and lift the standard. But height-wise, and that's why you see in a lot of cottage gardens they have a lot of the obelisks.
Yes.
Which are the classic kind of...
Describe what an obelisk is for those people, because it really is an arcane term.
Okay, right. It's a really, really tall, pointy pyramid. Like, you take a pyramid, you stretch it right up high, and it's often made of wrought iron.
And what's the point of it?
Well, the point really is to support climbing plants. So the point is to...
So it had a use at some point.
Yes, it had a use. It had a point. But the
it
wonderful...
did have a point at the top.
It does have a point. And they're quite ornate. If you can buy them anywhere, really. They're quite ornate. But the nice thing is that when the garden all dies down as well, you've got this structure in the centre of the garden that's nice to look at.
Yes.
So that's one part of putting in structure, but also going back on your point of trees and having a bit of height in the garden. Sometimes the use of standard roses.
Yes, of course.
Because you can have all of this abundance underneath, but the rose itself is up high.
And by standard rose, we mean those roses that are usually grafted so that you have a single stem and then a very round mass of roses on top, like a lollipop. Effectively,
rose.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, and mind you, they do need to be staked because they do get top heavy and fall over.
They do, and they also they can grow, if they're not in a good position, they'll sort of grow sideways or they'll go towards the light at least, and that can be a bit interesting as well. Then you end up with a very random looking rose.
Yeah.
But quite apart from that. So what other things would come to your mind for plants that would help with the structure in a cottage garden?
Well, I think this is where the really interesting conversation is. What we've been talking about with plants has been very much the traditional interpretation of the cottage garden. But now when we look at how do you do cottage garden in a more contemporary way, and how I'm seeing it done more so now, in Australia, but also in New Zealand, also in Britain and probably US, and a lot of these places that have embraced the cottage style, is about putting a neat edge around the border. So you are seeing a lot of a clipped little box hedge of some sort that gives a neat edge, and then the spill and the flourish and the excitement of the cottage all happens behind that neat border. So it doesn't
It's contained. It's a contained cottage.
It's a contained cottage. It's because most of us kind of feel this need to, we want a bit of chaos, but you want it to be in its boundaries.
Yeah, that's right, exactly. We'll have chaos, but we're going to limit you to that part of the garden. And it's interesting because it really almost when I said earlier, they are a low effort garden in that you're not doing a lot of clipping and, maintenance in terms of the shaping and the pruning. But when you introduce something like that in, you absolutely do, which changes the dynamic, because it was interesting because I am doing this friend's garden. She's very cottage style, loves all of the perennial flowers. And then she was showing me photos where there were all these little, highly clipped hedges. And I have to say, and I'm sure she won't mind me saying, but I just looked at her and I said, you won't be doing that. She is not in that category of person. Yeah. So you really do need to think about whether, if you're embracing cottage style, is that kind of effort the thing that you want to do in that more contemporary style?
Now might be a time to talk about the maintenance of a cottage garden. We still want to talk about materials and that sort of thing, but I think maintenance
we have to get on our horses. There's
so much to talk about.
There is so much to talk. We could talk about cottage gardens all day.
We could talk
It'd be pretty boring for most people, though.
But so maintenance, because I think a lot of people say, cottage gardens are really easy. And yes, it can be very easy insofar as you can throw a bunch of seeds and see what happens. You can have this great display. However, it's the next year and the next year where if you don't look at what is just coming up naturally and manage that, then you're going to have just a monoculture.
So that dominant plant effect that you were talking about before,
That's right.
But even before that, cottage gardens, if you don't get the mix right, can look very much like a fantastic garden in spring, maybe into a bit of summer, and then it kind of looks like a perennial wasteland after that, because you are using a lot of perennials, things that will come up and die.
Yes.
And we were talking before about, I love bulbs, and one of my early gardens, I planted so many bulbs, and oh my gosh, I was so over having these scrappy looking dead bulb, bits hanging around. Yeah, that's right, hanging around the garden. So I ended up, and I still do this, I've adopted this technique of braiding the old bulb the old bulb leaves to try and tie them up in gardens, because they just look so messy and they hang around forever.
This is a really good one, because people say, why don't you just cut them off? But why is that? Why don't you cut them off?
Because your plant and your bulb is drawing all its energy from its green parts, so that next year it can put on that fantastic floral display again. So you don't want to cut it off. You want to leave it there until it's absolutely dry, and at the end of the day, it's good mulch too for your garden.
Yeah. So plaiting your bulbs can be very therapeutic, actually. But what you do is get big chunks of foliage and do a big plait.
Yeah, that's right.
And sort of wind them up into nice little, rather than having it just sticking straight up.
Yeah, you coil them on themselves.
And the idea is you want all that foliage to see as much sun as possible, so that energy can go back into the bulb.
That's right. And in fact, I've adopted also a French braiding technique around the edges of paths and things to try and tidy up those bulbs.
I love it. There's
it works sometimes, but you do need bulbs that are in a reasonably well-spaced sort of row, which doesn't always happen. If you're a bit of a control freak,
which is what we're both coming across as being,
bit OCD,
then you can plait your bulbs.
Yeah, that's right.
So there's one maintenance tip. But another one is, if you want a second flush of these flowers, which most of them will deliver, you've got to get in when they start getting a bit ratty in summer, get in and cut them all back, and then you'll get another flush
that's
late
true.
Summer, early autumn.
But not bulbs so much.
No, not bulbs. No. We're talking about things like your catmint and your, I don't know, does lavender have another flush?
Lavender can, but it's less likely.
Yeah, salvias can.
You need to pick the ones and you need to do a bit of reading and research, because some of the, like if you cut nigella down, it's gone.
Yes.
It won't give you another flush either. Yeah. But some of the things actually, one of the things that, and it's a bit of a trade-off with some of these plants, is they do look scrappy when they're finished flowering, particularly those things that come up as annuals. But some of them also have beautiful seed heads. So the nigella and the poppies, you can leave those seed heads on for a while. One, they'll spread their seed again. But it also means that you've got a bit more of that structure for a bit longer in your garden until they start looking really manky, and then they sort of fall over and things anyway.
There are some plants that just look beautiful in their dying phases, which is just great.
That's right.
And we want to try and keep the garden interesting for as long as you can. So there's a real fad and shift now towards enjoying a late autumn garden, which is basically a lot of plants in their death states. And some look great and are worth keeping on there. So you just got to be a bit discerning about what you want to keep.
And you've got to shift your mindset from, plants have to be green and beautiful to I'm looking at the structure and, the dried deadheads and things like that, which I have been brought up to. As soon as there's a deadhead in the garden, you snip it off because you want to encourage some more flowering. So it is something you've got to get used to. So I think we need to go very quickly to what materials do you use in a cottage garden?
Yeah, look, this is great because think rustic, think secondhand, things that are a bit more cheap. Yeah, cheap and chip. Go to the green shed, or that's our kind of local big thrift store
Recycler.
where people just throw out old kind of building supplies and all sorts of things. And so the idea of getting cobbled bricks, cobblestones, gravel, they're the sort of materials you want for your surfaces.
Even things like in Canberra, we had an old brick factory in Canberra many, many years ago. So the Canberra red bricks are the things that are absolutely coveted for garden paving and are perfect for a cottage garden.
Yeah, they're made of clay, so they've got that kind of really redness about them.
Yeah.
Except they cost a bomb now because
they're so popular.
So popular.
That's right. But the other things that I think are worth thinking about, so the old railway sleepers are very much a sort of cottage thing that you can use in a cottage garden. So that greying, silvery wood look.
Yes.
But also mulch and wood chip as, your pathways, gravel pathways, things that are not so formal and structured. All of those, and they're great for the Australian landscape, particularly wood chip and mulch, because they are water retaining and they're weed suppressing.
Yes.
So, which is two things that you can never stray too far from.
Yeah. And I'm thinking some stone walls as well. Like if you could, even just like little low stone walls where you just sort of stack stone yourself, and then you can have things self-seeding and flowing out of the stone. That's really pretty as well.
Absolutely. So I think that's
and another one I just thought of, if you want to do this sort of control freak thing where you want to have a bit of a border it isn't going to be a clipped evergreen hedge, is you could plant out an apple step over.
So what is an apple step over as opposed to an apple turnover?
That's a very good question.
Do you have it with cream or ice cream?
We're not cooking any pies here, and there's no pastry involved. So an apple step over is a traditional kind of little boundary fence where you get really dwarf rooting stock apples and you put them at such an angle that they're really, really low lying, and they're sort of almost espaliered as a little fence, and it's called an apple step over because you can step over it into the garden.
Are they meant to bear fruit?
Yes.
No way.
That's
so
the whole
how
point.
high are we talking?
Oh, we're talking kind of 50 centimetres high.
Right.
Yeah, and so they're
bizarre.
really and they're kind of threaded together. So have a Google that. I'll put a picture on Instagram as well.
Great idea. But that is something that's then tending into the high maintenance space, obviously.
Yes. Yes, but also it goes back to the
productive element,
which is what the whole cottage garden's meant to be all about in the first place. And think how well pollinated those apples would be.
Oh, they would be superbly pollinated, absolutely.
Yeah.
So thinking just back on the sort of the materials and the things that you have in your garden, what else is there that really comes to mind?
Yeah, so the accessories are really important. We touched a little briefly on accessories when we're talking about materials, but one thing I want to really point out is things like a rustic garden bench, and this is where you get secondhand kind of timber, paint it up, put it, and I've seen some beautiful examples where little bistro seating where you've got like a little metal bistro set or a old timber outdoor bench, and then painting it a beautiful colour that reflects,
like a vibrant colour, that reflects the garden.
Some of the colours in the flowers. So a sort of periwinkle blue is a classic.
And I was thinking exactly periwinkle blue. It's
beautiful.
Or an aqua kind of blue as well, which can really complement some other colours.
Sort of a cerise pinky red that can look gorgeous as well. And in fact, I'm going to put a example on our Instagram that has the photos that complement our podcast recordings.
That sounds like a great idea.
And there's a particular garden I saw, Bearwood it's an English country garden in New Zealand, absolutely gorgeous.
English country garden, New Zealand. That is, it's got some work.
The
sorry.
New Zealanders do English country garden almost better than English.
Yeah, well,
they're
it's got to be a New Zealand country garden if it's in New Zealand. There's a problem with the name. I
know, it's funny, but it does it so well, and it has these pops of the same paint. It's the garden gate, the little bistro setting, the part of the arbor. There's this little pop of the same blue paint throughout the whole garden,
tying it all together,
and it gives it unity.
Yes,
rather than just this sort of profusion of other sort of colours and chaos, it gives the thing that gives it a sense of purpose and calm and unity.
And I think that's really important because that does bring that calm and balance in a garden, even if you're trying to get that chaotic, messy, unbalanced look in your plants. But I think we probably are at the point where we need to start wrapping ourselves up. What are the 3 takeaways for people who are looking to do a cottage garden or a cottage-like garden?
Cottage-like garden, yeah. So I'd say the first one is get your layout right. So think about how the flow is going to work, and you can do all that in winter. That's great. Yeah, so that's probably my number 1. Number 2, I'd say, is put some effort into selecting really second-hand, rustic, chisel, cobbled type of materials. That's going to give it the character that you want. And
make them look authentic, not fake.
Yes,
old.
yes.
Because I have to say, I struggle with fake old.
Yes, yes. And
there's plenty of old in this world.
And the best way to go get source things is second-hand market, because you find old things that are actually old.
That's right.
Oh, yeah, that's always a good one. And the third one is consider if it's a style that is right for you.
And why do you say that?
And I'm saying that because it isn't an all-season garden. Generally, a cottage style has its real punch, sort of spring, summer, and a bit of autumn. But if that's the garden that's going to make you happy and joyful, that's the garden for you. Otherwise, some other ways that we can use the cottage style is you can put cottage style planting incorporated into a bigger garden where you do have elements of structure and unity and other things.
And I think that is really important, particularly if you're, slightly OCD, like we've worked out that we are today, and you need that order and some more, organisation.
And some apple turnovers.
Yeah, and some apple turnovers, exactly. I think that's us for the week, Fleur.
Indeed. Look, it's been really fun talking about this topic, and I look forward to having another fabulous topic in 2 weeks' time.
That's right. So don't forget to follow us on Spotify, find us on Instagram or Facebook, and we'd love to hear your ideas and some feedback on how we're doing and what you'd like to hear about. We'll talk to you again in a fortnight. Bye.
Bye.